We're also gravely concerned by the escalating violence along the Thailand-Cambodia border and deeply saddened by reports of harm to civilians. The United States urges an immediate cessation of hostilities, protection of civilians, and a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And with that, I'll take some questions. Yes?
Thanks, Tommy. The special envoy's statement, does that suggest that the U.S. is pulling out of any sort of negotiating role in the Gaza ceasefire talks? What are these alternatives?
Well, look, ultimately the statement speaks for itself, but the question has never been our commitment to a ceasefire. The question has been Hamas's commitment to a ceasefire, and that has been made clear by the special envoy's statement. The fact that we have entered in good faith in trying to reach an end to this conflict. And as the special envoy said, we remain dedicated to trying to see an end to this conflict.
But will you work within the parties, Qatar, Egypt, for example, in the Doha format? Will you return to that? Or are you pulling out entirely from this format?
Well, look, again, I refer you back to this statement. This is a very dynamic situation. And ultimately, again, to reinforce, the question here has never been our commitment to try to get a ceasefire. We've seen that engagement. The question here has always been Hamas's commitment to a ceasefire or willingness to get there.
And can you give us any examples of the alternative options that Witkoff references in his statement?
At this point, I have nothing to preview. Yes?
Thank you. Just following up on that, what about the response from Hamas specifically made the administration feel that they were not acting in good faith?
Well, look, these are sensitive diplomatic conversations. We'll see in the days ahead as we proceed here. Ultimately, the special envoy's statement speaks for itself, but I think the broader context here is also important. The fact that we have seen Hamas first break that ceasefire that existed on October 7th, then break another ceasefire, and then here, as the special envoy makes clear, not acting in a way in order to achieve a ceasefire again. So to reiterate, the question has never been our commitment to a ceasefire. It has been Hamas's. They have shown that again and again and again, and have just shown it once again.
And this decision comes as dozens of people have starved to death in Gaza in the last few weeks as a wave of hunger is hitting the home. The WHO said yesterday that 21 children under the age of 5 were among those who died of malnutrition so far this year. And more than 100 organizations have called for the lifting of all restrictions on the flow of aid and all land crossings to be opened and the restoration of a UN-led humanitarian response. Given this decision today, is the U.S. considering any other steps to increase the flow of aid to Gaza? Are you talking with Israel about them taking any other steps? How do you move forward on the aid?
Well, look, ultimately what we have seen us do is the delivery of close to 90 million meals into Gaza during a war zone. The ability to deliver that aid in a way where it is not being looted by Hamas. That is what we have seen. We are, of course, aware, and of course, we want to see end the devastation that has taken place in Gaza. That's why we have seen this commitment to get aid to the people who need it in a way where it is not weaponized by Hamas. That commitment remains. It is a commitment from President Trump and Secretary Rubio. That is why we have supported the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. That is why we continue supporting the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. That is why we've seen those 90 million meals being distributed. And that commitment, again, to making sure that aid is reaching the people of Gaza that need it. And the first victims of Hamas being the people of Gaza, as is demonstrated once again here.
Is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation a sufficient mechanism for delivering aid to Gaza? I mean, people are still starving to death. Is that enough in the U.S. opinion?
Well, as spokesperson Tammy Bruce has said from this podium before, it is never enough in a war zone. It is never enough. That is why we're committed to trying to get as much aid in as possible. That is why we worked for that ceasefire, because of what we are seeing. But aid needs to be delivered in a way where it is not being looted by Hamas. So of course, enough, it is never enough in a war zone, but we're dedicated to getting as much aid into Gaza in a way where it reaches the people that need it as possible. And that's why we were working so hard for a ceasefire.
Okay, and sorry, I just have one question on the U.S. citizen that died in Syria, Hossam Soraya. Has the U.S. been able to ascertain any further details around the circumstances of his death?
So what I can say on this is, first, in terms of the circumstances around his death, I have nothing to confirm on this front. What I can say is we have had direct discussions with the Syrian government on this issue and have called for an immediate investigation into the matter. Hossam and his family deserve justice, and those responsible for this atrocity must be held accountable. Yes?
Hi, Tommy. I want to have a quick follow-up on that, and then I have a different subject I want to quickly ask you about, which is very relevant. Doctors Without Borders, internationally known and working with the U.S. for decades, is urgently calling for help beyond the foundation, because 1 in 4 young children and pregnant women, they say, are malnourished, and that it is a policy of starvation. Acknowledging 90 million meals and the progress, quote unquote, but there is a whole area of Gaza that is not being served by that. People can't get to it. It's only in one region in the south. And internationally, 28 countries, hundreds of aid organizations are calling for something more than that. There's been some acknowledgement from U.S. officials as well that there's real starvation. So is there any, now that the talks have collapsed and so that there's no immediate ceasefire that might relieve the pressure, is there any alternative that the State Department would begin looking at? And then I have just one other follow-up.
Well, a couple points. First, it is progress to see 90 million meals. That is, yes, and that is progress, and I think it is worth applauding, especially given the circumstances under which those meals were able to be delivered. I think another important context of this is that the first victims of Hamas are the people of Gaza. Of course, they're not the only victims.
Well, that's what we're talking about.
Yes, on October 7th. The atrocities that we saw there, many victims of Hamas. We remain dedicated to getting aid into Gaza to the people that actually need it, and we've called from this podium other entities to step up and working through this mechanism in order to deliver aid to the people of Gaza without it being subject to looting by Hamas.
Well, they're volunteering, but they can't get past the border. That's the problem.
We're calling for conversations with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, with under entities, through this mechanism. We've seen the food being delivered.
It's also fuel for the hospitals where the incubators are now taking multiple children.
We are incredibly aware of the humanitarian catastrophe that is happening there. That is the dedication you have seen from the president, the dedication you've seen from Secretary Rubio. Every single day we have conversations here at the State Department, every single briefing we have conversations here about getting aid into Gaza. It is a dedication of this administration. That's why we've seen the 90 million meals, the support of that effort from this administration. So, of course, we want to see as much aid getting into Gaza as possible in a way that is not being looted by Hamas. And this mechanism, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, has been a way to do that. So we're calling for additional support of that foundation to deliver that aid.
Okay, let me ask you this other question, though, because there is a lot of reporting, New York Times and elsewhere, about planned cuts in PEPFAR going forward. Now, just last week, Republicans led the way on the Hill in carving out the clawback that was proposed in PEPFAR and in continuing the program and expanding it beyond some of the contracts that were frozen under DOGE. Can you give us an update, a status update on where the State Department's thinking is on PEPFAR going forward?
Well, Secretary Rubio has stated that PEPFAR is an important and life-saving program that will continue. That dedication continues. That has been clear from the Secretary. The Secretary has made that clear. I will take a step back when we're talking about aid programs in general. Part of the new vision of this administration when it comes to aid is looking at recipients of aid, or at least the communities, as allies and partners, not those that are dependent on this aid. And in the long term, working towards a scenario where we have the same needs being provided by local partners or other entities is part of that long-term effort when we're talking about aid in general. So PEPFAR, though, now is an important and life-saving program that will continue. Secretary Rubio has made that clear.
And just to quickly follow up, some countries have moved towards taking ownership, South Africa, for instance, countries that are capable, but in conflict zones like Haiti, like Sudan, like Southern Sudan, like Somalia, and several other countries involved. Is there a plan to continue it until countries can stand on their own 2 feet?
Well, look, what I can say now is that PEPFAR, as I just said, that important and life-saving program that will continue. That's what our policy currently is here. Again, talking about that longer term, when we're talking about aid in general, is when we're talking about those local institutions being able to fulfill a lot of those needs, looking at people as trade and allies, not as those that are dependent on aid. That's a broader aid vision that is from this administration, but when it comes to PEPFAR, as I said, that it will continue. Yes.
Thanks, Tommy. The United Nations Security Council yesterday, the US was isolated in its position when it comes to the humanitarian situation in Gaza, support for the GHF. We've had the UK Prime Minister in the last hour saying the situation in Gaza is unspeakable and indefensible. We've had more than 100 humanitarian aid agencies saying that this system is creating the conditions of starvation. You have desperate Israeli hostage families who have been for weeks pleading with the Prime Minister of their country to do this deal. The US is the only power that has the leverage and the pressure to try and make that happen from the Israeli side. There is clearly a gap between Israel and Hamas. It's been there for a long time. And there are Israeli families who will say that this is quibbling over a few meters of territory in Gaza. This is quibbling over the number of Palestinian prisoners to be released. And the US could put the pressure on to move these two sides closer together. And can you help us understand why at this moment, when you see the conditions on the ground in Gaza, with now mass starvation, the US is deciding this is the moment to walk away from these talks?
This is not a question of what the United States is doing. It's a question of what Hamas has done. This is a response to what Hamas has done continually.
That's not actually the position of many of the Israeli hostage families.
Israel has long accepted the deal on the table, and Hamas has long rejected it. I mean, it's never been our commitment to a ceasefire. That's never been the question here. We have engaged in good faith to try to achieve a ceasefire. The question has always been with Hamas. That is where the question has been. That is where it remains. And the response we just saw from Special Envoy Witkoff is reflective of that. The question is with Hamas, not with the United States.
Just in terms, the statement says you'll now consider alternative options. I mean, to bring the hostages home, what possible alternative options can there be? Israel has tried rescues. Gaza is reduced to rubble. The population is starving. So, I mean, if you could help us understand what that statement could possibly be referring to.
I'm not going to speculate more on terms of what his statement stands for itself at this time. If we have more to announce, we will announce it.